The sun burned hot over Miami's exclusive Autolux showcase, where luxury cars shimmered like jewels beneath the glass ceiling. Every lens, every whisper, every heartbeat in that hall seemed to orbit around one man, Richard Vail, self-made millionaire, investor, and the face of wealth itself. He wore his arrogance like a designer suit. With one hand in his pocket and the other holding champagne, he grinned for the cameras. Behind him stood his crown jewel, a brand-new Ferrari SF90 straight ale, blood red and flawless. "This, ladies and gentlemen," he said with a smirk, "is not just a car. It's an attitude." The crowd applauded, flashes popping. Then came the silence, awkward, hesitant, as Richard climbed in, turned the key, and nothing happened. The Ferrari coughed once, then died. A nervous chuckle rippled through the crowd. Richard frowned, tried again. Nothing. His smile faltered. The first crack in his perfect image, minutes turned into whispers. Technicians rushed over, wires and scanners in hand. One wiped his forehead. "Sir, the diagnostics aren't reading." "It's not responding to the computer," Richard scoffed. "You're telling me a $200,000 car is smarter than you?" The crowd laughed politely, but unease lingered. At the back of the showroom, Eli Turner, a quiet janitor in a faded maintenance shirt, watched as he pushed his mop bucket along the polished floor. He wasn't supposed to stare, but he knew that sound, that silence. The kind an engine makes when it's trying to breathe. He hesitated, then called out softly, "Sir, might be the hybrid lockout system. Happens if—" Richard turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "I didn't ask the janitor for car advice." Laughter erupted. Cameras caught every word. Eli looked down, embarrassed, but not angry. He just whispered to himself, "Engines don't care who fixes them." The technicians gave up. The Ferrari sat dead, mocking its owner. Richard's face flushed red to match the car. He turned back toward Eli, bitterness glinting behind his smile. "You think you can fix it, kid?" Eli hesitated. "I could take a look." "No promises." Richard chuckled, turning to the crowd. "Tell you what. If he can make it run, I'll give him the car. But if he scratches it, he'll be mopping the parking lot for the rest of his life." The audience laughed again, phones raised to record. Eli nodded once, calm and unshaken. He walked forward, grabbed a small toolkit from his cart, and knelt beside the Ferrari. His eyes didn't see a car worth millions. They saw a system asking for understanding. The laughter faded as Eli's focus filled the room. He ran his fingers along the car's underbelly, opened a small panel beneath the steering column, and reconnected a pin-sized fuse cable, something the elite technicians had overlooked. He didn't rush. He didn't speak. He just worked, the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't need attention. Richard, impatient, muttered, "You done pretending yet?" Eli didn't look up. He simply said, "Almost." He sat in the driver's seat, pressed the ignition once, and the Ferrari roared to life. The sound shook the room. Cameras flashed. Gasps erupted. Richard's smile vanished. For a long second, no one moved. The only sound was the deep, smooth purr of the engine. Eli stepped out slowly, closing the door with care. He wiped his hands on his rag, eyes calm and steady. "Wasn't broken," he said softly. "Just needed someone to listen." The crowd exploded into applause, cheers, and disbelief. Phones streamed the moment live. Richard Vail, the man who thought himself untouchable, stood frozen, his phone still in hand, recording his own humiliation. Eli nodded politely, picked up his mop bucket, and began walking away. And as the crowd swarmed around the running Ferrari, one thing was certain. The world had just witnessed the beginning of a reckoning. By morning, the internet had already crowned its newest story. Millionaire mocks janitor, gets schooled in 3 minutes. Clips flooded social media, Eli kneeling by the Ferrari, the engine roaring, the crowd gasping. Comment sections burned with outrage. "He humiliated a working man. That janitor deserves the car, and the respect." This is why ego destroys success. Within 24 hours, the video hit 30 million views. Richard Vail's name was trending, not for his wealth, but for his arrogance. At his mansion, Richard scrolled through the comments, jaw tightening. His PR manager pleaded, "Sir, you need to make a statement. Apologize, clarify." "Clarify what?" Richard snapped. "That a janitor got lucky?" He slammed his laptop shut. The empire he'd built on status was beginning to crack, not from failure, but from humiliation. Meanwhile, in a tiny workshop on the edge of the city, Eli wiped grease off his hands and quietly fixed up an old engine. He didn't watch the news. He didn't care about the fame. A group of neighborhood kids peered through the window, whispering, "That's the guy from TikTok." Eli smiled gently. "Don't believe everything you see online, boys. What matters is what you learn." Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. A local news anchor wanted an interview. He sighed, hesitant. But Grace, an older woman who ran the nearby food shelter, nudged him. "Tell your story, son." Not to shame him, but to teach them. Eli nodded slowly. For the first time, he agreed to speak. The interview aired that night. Viewers learned what no one had known, that Eli Turner had once been a top student at an low engineering institute. He'd designed an innovative hybrid system years before anyone else, but his internship had ended abruptly after he called out bias in his workplace. No one hired him after that, so he mopped floors. While building engines in his spare time, the anchor asked softly, "How did it feel when he mocked you in front of everyone?" Eli smiled faintly. "People can only see what's on the surface. But engines, they teach patience. You listen, you learn, you fix. That's how people work too." The internet exploded again, but this time with admiration. Hashtags like "Respect Ally" and "Listen Before You Judge" trended globally. At Vail Industries headquarters, investors began pulling out. Stock prices plummeted. News channels replayed the viral clip side by side with Eli's interview. One anchor said it best. "In an age of luxury, a janitor just taught the world what real class looks like." Richard's board members demanded he step down from public appearances. He threw a glass across the room. "You think I'm the villain here? He made me look like a fool." His assistant whispered, "No, sir. You did that yourself." For the first time, silence filled the room. A week later, Eli returned to work, only to find a sleek black car waiting outside the shelter. Richard Vail stepped out, dark sunglasses failing to hide his exhaustion. Eli paused, cautious. "You lost your way?" Richard's voice was low, strained. "I came to make things right. Or at least to try." He held out the Ferrari's keys. "I said if you could make it run, it was yours." "A deal's a deal." Eli looked at the car, then at the man. He didn't take the keys. "I don't fix things for prizes, Mr. Vail. I fix them because they deserve to work." He handed the keys back. "What you really need to fix isn't made of metal." Richard stood frozen, keys trembling in his hand, realization beginning to surface. Richard Vail's mansion stood silent, once alive with parties, now echoing only his footsteps. He poured himself a drink, staring at the blank screens where stock prices had once climbed in green. A headline blinked from his tablet. "Vail Industries CEO under fire for discrimination scandal." He sighed. The board had suspended him indefinitely. Investors had abandoned him. Even the friends who once toasted his name now avoided his calls. His reflection in the glass showed a man who looked older, not by years, but by regret. He turned off the lights. For the first time in years, the mansion felt too big for one person. That night, thunder rolled over Miami. Richard sat in his car, the same Ferrari, outside the Autolux showroom, staring at the spot where it all began. Rain hit the windshield like judgment. He whispered to himself, "All that money, and I couldn't buy respect." His phone buzzed with another headline, a charity raising funds for underprivileged mechanics, started by Eli Turner. Thousands had donated. People he once called nobodies were now building something meaningful. For the first time, Richard didn't feel anger. He felt envy, not of wealth, but of peace. 2 days later, he drove to the same food shelter where he'd once met Eli. The place buzzed with life, volunteers handing out meals, kids laughing, engines being repaired in a small garage Eli had converted into a workshop. Richard hesitated at the gate. He didn't belong there, not anymore. Then he heard a familiar voice. "You can come in, Mr. Vale. We don't turn anyone away." Eli stood there, wiping his hands, smiling gently. Richard cleared his throat. "You built all this?" Eli nodded. "With help. People believed in what we could create, not what we could buy." The humility in his tone cut deeper than any insult ever could. Richard followed Eli inside. He saw young men and women learning mechanics, kids from the same neighborhoods that luxury had ignored. Every one of them looked up to Eli with respect that money could never command. Richard's voice cracked slightly. "You didn't take the car. You could have sold it and built this faster." Eli shrugged. "Maybe, but it's more powerful when something broken becomes useful again. That includes people." Richard stared at him, speechless. Then Eli said softly, "If you really want to make things right, help me expand this place. Not with a check, with your hands." The next morning, the entire neighborhood froze in disbelief. The same man who once humiliated a janitor now stood beside him, wearing gloves, grease on his shirt, teaching kids how to fix engines. No cameras. No PR stunt. Just silence, sweat, and effort. Someone whispered, "Is that Richard Vale?" Eli smiled faintly. "Yeah. Turns out engines aren't the only things that can be rebuilt." As the sun set, the Ferrari still sat outside, untouched, gleaming, waiting. But Richard didn't look at it anymore. He had found something far rarer than speed or luxury: purpose. Weeks passed. Every morning, Richard Vale showed up at the workshop, not as a boss, not as a billionaire, but as a volunteer. He fixed broken engines, stacked boxes, and handed out meals. At first, people stared. Some didn't believe it was really him. Others whispered that it was just guilt. But Eli watched him closely. He saw the small changes, how Richard listened more, spoke less, and smiled for no reason at all. One afternoon, Richard stayed behind after everyone left. He stood in front of a rusted old car in the corner, a forgotten heap that no one bothered to touch. Eli walked in. "You've been staring at that thing for days," Richard chuckled. "Yeah, I guess I know how it feels, left behind but still standing." Eli nodded. "Then maybe it's time to rebuild both." And they did. Together. Word began to spread. The same man who once mocked a janitor was now fixing engines for free in the poorest neighborhood of Miami. News outlets came rushing back, but this time, Richard refused interviews. "If they want to see what's changed, they can come help," he told Eli. Soon, local mechanics, students, and even former Vale Industries employees joined the cause. They built something larger, the Turner Vale Foundation, a program to train underprivileged youth in auto repair and green. Engineering, the same cameras that once filmed his arrogance now captured his humility, and people noticed. One afternoon, while the foundation hosted a community event, a familiar face appeared among the crowd. Grace, the woman who'd encouraged Eli to tell his story. She smiled warmly at Richard. "Didn't think I'd see you around here again?" Richard laughed softly. "Didn't think I'd be worth seeing." Grace touched his arm. "You're not the same man from that video." That's the real story now. Nearby, a young boy asked Richard shyly, "Mister, can rich people really change?" Richard knelt beside him, smiling. "They can, but only when they stop trying to be rich and start trying to be right." The crowd applauded. Eli just nodded quietly, proud. A few weeks later, Richard received a letter, sealed with the emblem of Vale Industries. Inside, a proposal. The board wanted him back. His public redemption had revived the brand. Investors were interested again. He stared at the letter for a long time. Then he looked at the kids in the workshop, the laughter, the teamwork, the spark of hope that money couldn't buy. Eli entered. "Going back?" Richard smiled faintly. "Maybe not to who I was, but to do things right this time." Eli nodded. "Then take what you've learned here and make it mean something bigger." They shook hands, not as janitor and CEO, but as equals. When Richard walked into the Vale Industries headquarters again, the staff froze. No designer suit, no entourage. Just a man in rolled-up sleeves carrying a folder labeled Project Humanity. He addressed the board. "We spent years selling luxury. Now it's time to build legacy." He announced a massive initiative to convert the company's factories into green tech training centers, hiring youth from disadvantaged communities. Silence followed. Then, slowly, the board stood and applauded. The cameras outside caught him leaving the building, smiling quietly as Eli called him on speaker. "How'd it go?" "We just tuned a bigger engine," Richard said. "This one runs on purpose." Months passed. The Turner Vale Foundation had grown beyond the little garage where it began. Workshops opened in Atlanta, Detroit, Chicago. Every one of them run by people who once had no second chance. News outlets now called it the movement of restoration. In one clip, a single mother smiled into the camera, her hands covered in grease. "They gave me skills, confidence, and a way to feed my kids. They didn't just fix engines. They fixed lives." Eli stood backstage during a televised interview, watching Richard speak to a national audience. But this time, Richard didn't talk about profits or prestige. He said simply, "The most valuable engine in the world is the human heart. When it's neglected, it stops running. When you care for it, it changes everything." Applause filled the studio. And for the first time in his public life, Richard Vale didn't smile for the cameras. He smiled from the soul. One evening, as the Miami sun sank behind the skyline, Richard drove the same blood-red Ferrari back to the Foundation's original garage. The car gleamed, flawless, but symbolic now, not prideful. Eli looked up from a workbench. "Didn't think I'd see that car again?" Richard parked it beside the kids' training area and handed over the keys. "I don't need it anymore. Let's auction it, build 5 more centers with the money," Eli laughed. "You sure you're ready to let go of your favorite toy?" Richard smirked. "It's not my favorite anymore. This place is." A month later, that same Ferrari sold for over $2 million. Every penny funding new opportunities for youth across the country. And on the auction day, Eli and Richard stood side by side, clapping for something far greater than luxury: legacy. Months later, Richard was invited to speak at a global business summit, the same kind of elite gathering where he'd once flaunted his wealth. But this time he took the stage differently. No suit, no ego, just truth. "Years ago, I humiliated a man for trying to help me. That moment destroyed my reputation and rebuilt my character. What I learned is simple. Wealth without empathy is poverty in disguise. Power means nothing if you can't use it to lift someone else." The audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. Executives wiped tears. Some even signed pledges to fund social repair programs. Backstage, Eli waited. "Not bad for a guy who once called me a janitor. Not bad for a guy who taught me what leadership really means," Richard replied with a grin. The two men shook hands again, a symbol now immortalized by every camera in the room. 1 year later, the Turner Vale Global Initiative hosted its first international gala. Guests from over 20 countries gathered in a hall adorned with photographs, not of celebrities or cars, but of smiling youth who had found hope through the program. Eli stepped on stage to thunderous applause. "When we started, we just wanted to fix broken engines. But along the way, we discovered the truth. It's never about fixing machines. It's about fixing hearts." He turned toward Richard. "And sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who grow beside us the farthest." The audience rose again, emotional. Richard stood, his eyes glistening. For the first time, he bowed his head in humility. Years later, a plaque hung on the wall of the Foundation's first workshop, built on redemption, fueled by humanity. Outside, a new generation of students laughed and worked together, young men and women of every color. Background and dream. An old photograph rested on Eli's desk. Him and Richard. Side by side, grease on their shirts, smiling like brothers. The camera panned to a new mural painted above the entrance. A red Ferrari, half metal, half heart, surrounded by hands building it together. Beneath it, words in bold letters read, "Respect, restore, rise." And as the final scene faded, Richard's voice narrated softly, "I once thought success meant being admired. Now I know. It means making others believe they matter." The screen faded to black, the logo of Shades of Humanity appearing with the closing words, "Because every soul deserves a second ignition."